Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. This week I had the opportunity to talk to Cher Murphy, who is a brand new partner at OnPartner, an executive search firm. She also is an adjunct professor at Pepperdine in their MBA program, and she teaches custom programs at the University of Michigan as well. This week, we got to talk to Cher about leadership and how leadership today might look different in 5 years and what is key for leadership moving forward. There were a few things that stood out to me about this conversation. The first one was the very human approach that Cher took to this entire conversation. While she's very aware that the machines are coming in, that there are new tools to help people be better leaders, the real solid leadership-y types of things she thinks are still very human. For example, she says that machines can definitely assist, but humans own discernment and they own empathy and they own real decision-making. And the technology isn't there where we can outsource all of those things to robots as of right now. She also said something really interesting about your gut. I asked the question about using the good old HR gut check versus using the data that seems to be ubiquitous in the systems that we're using in HR. And she said that we shouldn't ignore our gut. We should question our gut. So whereas data has flaws, and if you look at the sources, they might introduce flaws that will skew the outcomes of that data. Your gut is the same way. You might have a response to a particular bit of information. Instead of just running with it or just ignoring it because it's only the quote unquote gut, you should figure out where that came from. You should take a look at your biases or where you might have gotten that information or the context with which you're using to make the decision. And so she sees the gut and data as both very useful in helping leaders make better decisions. One of the discussions that I really appreciated was this idea of leadership as a system, not a trait, and how it has to be embedded across the organization. She says that a leader can carry an organization leadership-wise for a while, and a leadership system can also carry an organization for a while in the face of a weaker leader, but that a leader that can reinforce a leadership as a system is probably the best of both worlds. The final thing that stood out to me as part of this conversation was the discussion around how success of leaders now really depends on being able to lead cross-functional teams and cross-collaboration. So a leader used to come in and just lead L&D or just lead talent management or talent acquisition. That's no longer enough because all of these teams are converging on each other. But she mentioned that it goes even farther than that. As AI sort of weasels its way into the organization, we now need to also collaborate with technology, the technology function or the finance function or the data function to make sure that we're all working together in order to get the work done. This was a really fun conversation with Cher. I know Cher. She's delightful and kind. And so just that made it really fun and it will be fun to listen to. But she brought a level of depth to the idea of leadership and made me think differently about it than I had before, which I really appreciated. If you like this episode, please subscribe and please tell at least one other person how much you got out of it. And if you'd like to learn more about the research that we do, please visit redthreadresearch.com. Welcome to Workplace Stories, Cher.
Thanks, Dani. I'm so excited to be here.
We're super happy to have you. As we get started, tell me a little bit about your role and what you do.
Great. Well, I have been in talent strategy for over 15, probably 17 years now. Most recently, for the past 4 or 5 years, I've had my own firm called the Murphy Advisory, where we focus on executive coaching, succession planning, organizational development, and leadership development. And recently, last week, I joined OnPartners as a partner to be the head and build their People and Talent Practice.
Woohoo! Congratulations.
Thank you.
You also, if I remember correctly, you teach at a couple of universities, yeah?
Yes. So I am adjunct professor for Pepperdine in the MBA class courses and a few other of their master's programs. I teach traditionally talent management and cross-cultural management, diversity, and inclusive organizations. And I recently have joined University of Michigan Ross School of Business as guest faculty for their executive education custom programs.
Which makes me super happy because I live in Ann Arbor, and so I get to see you every once in a while. That's great.
Yes, I'm thoroughly thrilled to be able to meet you for coffee at Zingerman's again.
Yes, in the warm weather, because last time it was pretty damn cold. Yeah. All right. So today we're going to talk about leadership and kind of the future of leadership. So I'm super happy to have you here. We want to establish some credibility. So why should people listen to you on the topic of leadership?
Gosh, I don't know why anybody listens to me on any topic, but I would say professionally, I have spent my entire career working with executive teams and boards and leaders across industry, across the globe. But I really think the reason why people listen to me is that I bring a candor and a transparency about what works and what doesn't work, along with a mindset about what's possible. And so being an anthropologist originally, education, with those kind of perspectives and mindsets and experience, give me a unique view that people can learn things that they might not learn from traditional leaders.
I like it. If there's one word that I could use to describe you, it is candor. I love that you tell how it is, and I expect that today as we talk.
Great.
So let's start with maybe a really broad question. What do you think the difference is between leadership of the future versus the leadership that we have now?
I'm so glad we have a long time to talk about this because this is really the key question that I hear from clients, from students, from colleagues in different industries. Like, what are those differentiators? And though we have had many technological transformations and we went digital, we have not experienced this global political or the speed of technology, especially generative AI, actually changing the workforce in the way that it did. This is monumentally different than, okay, I think we need a chief digital officer. And so the biggest difference would be, or I think it really is in mindset perspective, I think it is speed. And I think it is the biggest piece is to be able to translate context and bring people along at a speed that we haven't seen before.
Okay. So speed. So when you think about where we are right now, because a lot of leaders would say, no, I'm decisive and I have speed. I do those things. So what do you think leadership needs to shift as far as priorities go to meet that speed?
And I don't know if it's just speed, right? I think it's speed in the midst of an environment where we haven't had trust. That is really, because we've had speed before. We've had like, here's a pandemic, adapt. But we haven't had this kind of like speed and trust at the same time. So it really is being able to balance critical thinking along with keeping that human first perspective that we had to exercise that muscle during the pandemic. This is like taking it on a whole new level.
Okay. At the Red Thread, we've been hearing a lot more. I mean, it's always been a thing, but lately we've been hearing a lot more about workforce planning, like strategic workforce planning. It's back. Like it's back with a vengeance because of how quickly things are changing. And so, whereas we used to hear about like a 5-year plan or your plan for the year and those types of things, most leaders are telling us that they can't plan more than 6 months out because things change so freaking fast. And so when you think about that mindset, I want to go back to the thing about the mindset. How do you get leaders to think different? Or how do you recognize leaders that can think faster? Like they can use it strategic thinking to do all the things faster.
It is strategic thinking with adaptability. So before it was like speed with how do we build trust? Now this is like looking at workforce planning with this ability to have adaptability at a multiple that we haven't had before. And so like, how do we get people to do that, to really go from kind of control to clarity with their teams? That's like the road to the destination.
All right. So earlier you mentioned that right now leaders are seeing the need to move more quickly and there's been an erosion of trust. The first question I have with respect to that is, how do you think trust is eroded and how do you think leaders get that back?
Yes. The story of the erosion of trust, I think really started before the beginning of the pandemic. There were pieces from that. And I think every time as you have a career across multiple years, like we learn from something each time it happens, right? So market crash, mortgages. Each time we learn something. But before the pandemic, I think we started seeing, this is so interesting. I love this. And I'm such a contrarian. People are going to love this story, but we started seeing like this very increase in employer branding. And I was part of it. I was a chief people officer for an employer branding company. And I was one of the first people who was all about trust, all about employee branding, right? So align your personal values, your personal purpose with your company purpose. And the world took that on fire. And I think it's one of the things that kind of broke trust on top of the pandemic. So we tried to take people and align their personal value, their personal purpose with the company purpose. We used that to like work them a ton. We used that to get as much, we thought it would be driving engagement. I think it drove engagement, but I think it's one of the things that drove burnout too. It's also one of the things that drove anxiety for the younger generation that doesn't have trust, that had to go through the pandemic being completely remote. And so there's all these things about this overuse of purpose and then a pandemic, and now this huge political and economic challenges. And I think those are some core concepts that cause this.
Okay. So organizations maybe promised and then didn't deliver on these ideas. So I get what you're saying. Like I remember hearing, you want to work somewhere where your purpose aligns with the organization and blah. And in my head, at my age, I was just like, no, I want to work somewhere and then go home at night. That's my goal. But we saw it. Like I remember when Elon Musk took it over at Twitter, they had people sleeping under their desks because they were all in for all the things. So what you're saying is like organizations took that and exploited, for all intents and purposes, workers to magnify that to get where they were going. And because of that, employees lost trust in the organizations that they worked for and the leadership.
I think so. And I know that's I'm going to like upset half of the HR world by saying that. But I think we were all trying to look at different ways because we already had low engagement scores with Gallup. And the newest ones that came out this week were further down on lack of engagement than we have been as well. So you take that plus a pandemic, plus a current economic and political division, and I think that organizations didn't always follow through. And here's the thing. I think the key point, because you were saying, how do you rebuild trust? And it's not that they didn't follow through or they couldn't. There were so many things that happened in organizations that we couldn't do what we said we were going to do. But here's the key. The key to building trust is to communicate your logic. So I talk about building trust before I talk about anything else right now with organizations. And I'm a huge fan of Francis Frey and Ann Morris on the trust triangle, which is how do we build trust or rebuild trust? You have to have empathy, you have to have authenticity, and you have to be able to communicate your logic. And every one of us has one of those that we're not as strong at. And if we can recognize that, so just as a leader, not even thinking about doing anything with your team by yourself, if you can identify, hey, I'm good with the empathy, right? I'm good with authenticity, but like the communication of my logic, the communication of why we didn't follow through or why we couldn't give the employees what we said we would, that is a place where a lot of leaders can rebuild trust.
Okay. Do you think in the current climate that is going to happen?
The increasing, like better communication of logic or building trust?
Both, right? So you mentioned several things and many of them were external to the organization itself, right? Like the pandemic, organizations didn't have anything to do with that. The economy, they don't have anything to do with. So all of these things are happening that are making organizations respond. I think that the communication is probably one of the things that is one of the bigger factors in why we might not trust the organization. But I also understand maybe there are legal implications to that or market implications to being completely honest about all the things. So I'm just wondering, like, how do we balance all the shareholders and stakeholders to make sure that everybody gets what they need?
But here, I don't think it's even about people getting what they need. I think it's about communicating. We're not all going to get what we need, and especially in the environment we're in. But to communicate, this isn't going to happen. Or communicate, we heard you, and this is the choice we had to make for the company. There's nothing, like, I think that's the missing. And it's like a basic we all learned when we started doing employee listening, and we took all this data, and the basic that you can ask any head of L&D will be like, or talent management is, okay, we might not be able to do things, but are we communicating? This is what we heard, and we can't do anything about that. We're getting back to the source of people just want to do good work with good people, and good leaders, even if they aren't giving good news, can keep the communication going. And that is one of the legs of trust.
Okay. Do you think communication like that needs to come from the top, or do you think this is maybe a leading question? But I'm assuming that ability to communicate needs to be held by all leaders in an organization.
Exactly. Because let's be honest, we probably have people who are listening to the podcast who are like, I'm not in the C-suite. What am I supposed to do? But we all have a version of where the level that we're leading at, even if we're individual contributors, that we can communicate.
So is the answer, we don't know, a good enough thing to communicate down? Because I think about how quickly leaders are needing to make decisions right now, and how none of the decisions that they're making right now have precedent. There are no Harvard business cases out there to read to figure out what to do in any of these cases. So I'm wondering, is it okay just to be like, you know what, we don't know yet. We're trying this right now. We're doing the best we can, but we don't really know.
And I don't even know if it's exactly that much of we don't know. It could be we're in the middle of this. We're finding more out. It might even be a great opportunity to say, we'd like to hear from you, or not even we'd like to hear from you on the problem, coach, we're recoaching people to say, can you come with the solutions? I think everybody's brains were so tired, and we have so many different things going on with so many stakeholders, can't talk today, that we need that opportunity to say hey, we're working on it.
Okay.
Or if this is what we're trying, or asking another question.
So let's talk about those leaders for just a second. You have spent most of your life looking for good leaders, putting leaders in places, teaching leaders, all that good stuff. What do you think the characteristics are of leaders to help them stay calm and grounded in situations like VUCA situation, where everything is volatile and uncertain and chaotic?
So I think there's actually even a new term for VUCA, right?
I think there is. Yeah.
Is it Baki or something? So interesting that we're this is so much. We have to change the terminology. I think it's two things. I think first is having some sense of self-awareness, because we used to just say people should have EQ. I think things are moving too fast that people are even do I have EQ? Do I not have EQ? So just having some awareness about what you do well, what you don't do well, and then adding that with consciously having critical thinking, looking at things through a critical thinking lens or decision-making lens, and putting those two together. Because what that really does is give us some inner steadiness. I know who I am. I know, it gives people the ability to pause, which sounds like a consultant's answer, because we just told people that we need to go fast. But in order to stay calm and grounded, there has to be self-awareness, some pause, and the ability to apply context.
Okay, let's talk about that context piece, because it's really interesting to me right now. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago, and this is something that the station and I have been saying for a really long time, but people were saying it to me now. They were saying, I think we're in a world now where all of the people practices are converging on each other. It's hard to have a conversation about talent development unless you have a conversation about mobility and workforce planning and talent management and all of the things. They're all one big, huge discussion now. And I think that's accurate. In most organizations, there are still all of these separate people functions. And so as you think about leadership and putting people in sort of those key spots for those key sort of people leadership positions, how do you find the right people to be able to converge those things? Even if they're not converged under one senior leader, there's a level of sort of coordination and collaboration that is now really necessary in organizations that maybe wasn't there before.
Here's what I like to say. I think it's always been there. That's just me. I think that there's a magnifying glass on it. You did have certain industries who would have the talent acquisition, talent management coming together. And that would bring some great things, and it would take some things out of it. I think the things that you're talking about, to be able to have this ability to have the context of a talent strategy, a true style, which is basically just an understanding of the business strategy and how it's executed through people. The problem that you just said before, 2 questions, is if that is changing, is that strategy changing? I think that's that clarity piece. In the weird, strange uncertainty that we're in, I think sometimes some of the leaders are going let's change the strategy. When that's not what we really need. We need that steadiness and the stableness of the strategy. You just have to be able to adapt where you're doing that. So I think in this kind of like reactionary period that people are in, people are grabbing things. But across any people strategy, we have to be able to like not just communicate with other people in kind of the HR learning talent space, but are we able to understand the finance, like the conversation between the like the people in the finance organization, not just CFO, right? We used to just say that the chief people officer and the CFO need to be, like their teams need to be able to talk about how these things affect each other. So I think the magnifying glass is just having us having this critical thinking lens and seeing how that the silo ability doesn't work as much. And if we're going to have any chance in speed and this contradictory, slow down, have a pause, speed up, people have to be able to communicate.
Are you seeing structures in organizations maybe a little bit different in the people functions?
Well, I do think that this whole workforce planning piece, that revision of that. So everybody's trying to look at like, how are we going to change management with people has been organizational development. But organizational development doesn't have a very scientific sound to it. And sometimes people mistake it for a little bit of a kind of learning and development, which it really is just the people part of change management. So we're seeing like organizational development merge with some type of workforce planning, and then maybe taking somebody from people analytics so that you have these multidimensional. You're also seeing where in a lot of roles that are open for learning and development leaders, they're asking these people who have been the strategy for learning to have this organizational effectiveness piece too. And so those learning development people haven't had spent as much time in people analytics to be able to deliver that.
Yeah. So the formal structure isn't changing, you're saying, necessarily. Just the need to collaborate across the structures is changing a little bit.
I think there's an increased need to collaborate across the structures. I do think there's a lot of design changes happening. Great. We just saw Moderna this week say, we're going to put the chief people officer to be head of tech at the same time. I think we've always been playing design musical chairs in HR to try things out. In the beginning, people analytics was with HR operations under total rewards. That makes no sense to us today.
I do think the Moderna move is a really interesting one, right? Because IT has always been in conflict or sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum of the people. And now we're saying, no. What we really care about is that the work gets done. And that's going to involve technology and especially this LLM and Gen AI stuff and the tasks that it can do and the people and the tasks that they can do and how they work together. And so we're not talking about, this kind of goes back to my point, we're seeing sort of the people functions converge on each other, but we're also seeing those others that you mentioned, like finance and marketing and operations and technology. It's all becoming one great big conversation about how we get the work done, not what are all the pieces to help us get the work done.
Absolutely. I think it was interesting. Probably about 10 years ago, we saw the first talent acquisition teams not be functional or across industry. We saw LinkedIn really help people kind of revise how the work got done inside of talent acquisition. 10 years forward, we're really looking at how does that work get done? And we're not only having to do it at where the work's getting done, we have to have a conversation with the board about how the work's getting done, and then also with the executive team. So I think it's different. And then it also has to communicate to different stakeholders more than it ever has.
That's interesting. Let's take a break because we want to go a little bit further into the machines, the robots that are going to take our jobs. But first, let's do lightning round. And these are questions that just help us get to know you just a little bit. So you have, I know from talking to you, you have a dog named Arlo, I think his name is. If your pet could talk, what would they say?
Usually what I say to Arlo is I say something to him like, I don't work for you.
But you do.
But I kind of do. So I think what Arlo would say was like, I'd like to have a performance management conversation with you. Let's just have a reflective feedback conversation about how you're doing as a parent or a mom or whatever. I really think that's what he does when he sits in my office, because today he's at daycare, so he's not here. I just saw your dog, which was awesome, but both having paddle dogs, they're busy.
Yes, very busy. What job would you be terrible at?
Oh my God, what job would I be terrible at? I want to say something like grading the CPA exams that they have to, like, I would be awful at that. Or something like washing window. Like, I don't have a fear of heights, But I think I'd have a fear of heights if I had to wash the window and be up there. So I think I would be awful at that.
Okay. The CPA games, that's a good one. Hopefully the robots can do that soon.
They can. They already do. But I'm just saying that seems like my own special kind of hell.
Yes, it definitely does. All right, last question. What was your last Netflix binge?
Okay, it's not Netflix. It's on Prime. But I was on a really long flight and I watched the entire season of Wear Whatever the F You Want, which is the...
Oh, yeah. Yes. With Clayton and what's her name?
Yeah, Stacey London.
Stacey, and yeah.
Clinton Kelly.
Clinton,
used
that's
to have
right.
that show about what not to wear, which was like, I loved because fashion is like not my absolute favorite kind of thing. And I do some things and it's an entire show about, hey, 10 years ago, we told you this. Guess what? We were wrong. The world has changed, right? Which is like what we do for like, hey, 10 years ago, we told you this is what leadership looked like, hierarchical command control. But hey, guess what? We were really wrong. It's about asking questions. So it was just the best long flight to watch that entire show. So.
Okay. I'm going to put that on my list of things to watch. I used to love that show too. I was like, I will never look like that, but that's me.
It's fascinating.
It's aspirational for me, looking that put together. Yes, cool. Okay, I'm going to watch that. Okay, let's jump back into some questions. These have more to do with the very realness of Gen AI and some of the things that it's doing with us. So the first question I have for you is, as machines become co-pilots in leadership, and we've seen some coaching AIs and things like that, what do you think we should not hand over to them?
So first of all, I think the very first thing that we can decide that humans should do is like discernment. I think when you can ask, one of my favorite people that I spend time with is Jeff Wetzler, who wrote a book called Ask, which is about questions. And he helped me with this great prompt where I can put something into Gen AI and then ask it to listen with more empathy, ask it to listen for more insights, right? So even though I can ask it to do that, it cannot discern at the end of those insights what action I should really take. Now you could try, you could ask it, but I don't think that's where the beauty of it really is. So that's like my big main thing. My one special gratitude for generative AI is that we no longer have to have the conversation about hard skills and soft skills. We don't have to ever say soft skills because we get to say human skills versus technical or whatever. But anyways, just to have the term soft skill dead would be really great for me.
Okay. I heard that in both of your answers there. This idea that there are human things that robots are never going to be able to take over. And you mentioned empathy for sure. Talk to me a little bit about why you see empathy as key to good leadership.
First of all, the interesting piece of that, I just had another conversation with Jeff Wetzler, and he was like talking about how questions, we can't put ourselves in other people's shoes. That doesn't really ever help, but we can have more empathy. And I think that is going to be like, we have to get that. We are in a world right now that isn't valuing empathy. Like, I almost feel maybe I shouldn't say that, but I basically say what I think anyway. So that's great. But I think it is a skill set that in this environment, we're slowly going to lose if we don't exercise that muscle.
Interesting. Okay, let me raise this to you. For a really long time, HR it hasn't been a positive thing when people talk about the good old HR gut check. And I actually use that as a joke sometimes, right? Like, don't use the gut check, let's check the data. And so we're now awash in data. There's the data coming from every single program that we use in organizations. And we have the ability, if we go digging in the data and look for insights, to make much more logical and reasonable decisions instead of using our gut. What does good decision making look like for a leader, given what you just said and the fact that we now have access to all of this data?
Wow. Well, I would say it is interesting with Gen AI and that we are talking about what's human first versus. So here's the thing. I think that humans love science because we want proof and we want data. And there's a lot of good. And we can now go back and look at where the data shows us that our biases are completely incorrect in a lot of ways. But I also think there's a little piece of that humans just want certainty. Okay. And so they don't want to, we are all moving towards like everything science, everything, right? And so it is like, how do we balance this human first, like being a human thing? But I do think there's a piece where you, like, for me, when I have a decision to make, like, my first thing is, yes, not only what is the data, like, where did my data come from? I had a student do that this week at Pepperdine who I had an HBR article, and he went into that person who wrote its data, and it was like from a source that he was like, I can't believe they used the source. So that's, on top of that. But there is a piece then that I'm going to look at it from a human and be able to ask myself, like, what is my gut decision being driven by? What clarity is that providing? Where is the critical thinking on this? And then I also think that there's a reason why we need good coaches and good mentors and good community. I've sent you an email in the past to be like, what do you think about this? This is where I'm going, just to be able to check the humanity piece of the techno, and then to be able to bring those two together. Now that feels like that might take a little bit more time. And Gen AI is great and data is great, but Gen AI is like a really smart cat.
Yeah. Okay. So you said something that I think is really interesting. When you started talking about the data and then used the example of the Pepperdine student and said they went into the data and they realized that the data was basically crap or wasn't valid because of blah, blah, blah. And this was an HBR article where you would think that they would maybe check. We can get from that, it's data, and there still can be mistakes in that data. But the other thing that you said, which I think is really interesting, is you said, question your gut. Like, where is your gut coming from? What are your assumptions associated with that? What are your biases? What are all the things that are helping you make the decision or come to the decision that your gut has? I think that's interesting because I'm not sure I've ever thought of it like that. Like, question the gut. Don't disregard it. But it is probably aware of things that the data may not be aware of. You just need to understand where they're coming from so that it can be explained. So it's valid.
And then the other piece is, in some of this instances from a consultant side or from an HR team side, God, I'm going to say this, I'm going to get so much in trouble, but I have this one chief people officer who I spend a lot of time with, and he says to me, our job is to be helpful, not correct. So I might even come up with the correct answer from the data. And let's see, like, I can push the culture. I can do all the things I can do, but I still want to be able to take whatever I'm getting from the data and from the human aspect. And am I being helpful? Not just trying to be correct, because we all have had an experience where we've come to an executive team or a board, and even though it was very clear that we thought that was right, there are other decisions that are made.
Interesting. Okay. I want to go back to maybe like universal leadership skills and abilities and characteristics. So when you are looking for leaders or training leaders or coaching leaders, are there a set of characteristics that you've honed in on that you're like, yes, all of these things all leaders need, regardless of where we put them? Do you have that kind of list? Or is it all contextual?
That takes like, we could like to say this, right?
No, but I'm interested in this because I've looked at the leadership development training as like a whole, and there are like 60 to 70% that all say the same thing. And so I'm really curious, like, as you're thinking about putting somebody in a particular position, do you feel like that there are characteristics that are the same regardless of where you put them? Or is it really contextual?
Oh, gosh. I mean, being an anthropologist, I'm like, the culture, right? If I put somebody in, we used to always say this, if you put somebody in like a massive big tech firm, that would be like such a different culture of, I can tell you, I work with EO and YPO leaders. And if you put them in a massive tech thing, it'll kill them off. But here's the thing I will say. There are like, I don't know if it's characteristics. I can turn them into verbs, but I can turn them into nouns. But like, I will say the ability to ask good questions.
Okay. So would you say that's curiosity, or is that like?
Because you can be curious, but not ask the question. Come from a place of curiosity. I also think we just like the word curiosity right now. So we have to really, like when words start getting
I do.
all the time, I have to be like, okay, hello, buzzword. What does that actually mean? Right?
That's fair. Okay. So ask good questions.
Good questions. I also think like we need people to be good listeners. And then the other thing is, and this could say, I got to spend time this weekend with my very first like big boss. And that was a long time ago and in the investment industry. And he is known for saying a statement, which is feed the positive. Doesn't mean you're not aware of the context of the negative, but like in a really hard situation, you can be aware and take action for the things that are challenging or negative, but to be able to feed the positive and feed that back to his team. He was 2 tours of Vietnam, what they did there. So I think there's some leadership in asking questions, listening, and being able to feed the positive.
So the things, and there's been a thread throughout this whole thing, all of your responses are very human focused. Like, even though we've talked about technology and how that plays a role in this, all of your answers have been really, really like human focused. When we think about sort of leadership rather than management, we think in terms of the humans. We're entering an era where I'm truly wondering what the role of a leader is. Is the leader still just focused on the humans? Are we switching a leader over to be responsible for how the work gets done? Do you think leaders will take on a larger role that may split their focus between the people and how we use the people to get where we're going and the people and all the other resources and how we use them to get where we're going?
I think that the hard thing is that the leadership part and the human part, that's like table stakes. We don't hire people just because they're good leaders. You hire somebody for, here's the work that has to get done, and here's thing. And I think that's why the industry of leadership development is, let's try to make them good leaders, because if you add that with what the work that needs to get done from a technology or strategy or analytic, right? Industrial, manufacturing, anything, it is a multiplier.
Okay, so leadership is a multiplier. And you've also mentioned a little bit ago the importance of culture and the ability of a leader to thrive in a particular culture. And I have seen this and experienced this. If you don't jive with the culture, it doesn't matter how good of a people person you are, it's just not going to work. So my next question is, for a little bit of background, Station, I think in terms of systems, like don't change the people, change the systems. And so I'm curious about leadership as a system. If I leave that a wide open question, can you talk about leadership as a system?
So my perspective is informed from I'm an anthropologist, which is all about systems. I went back to school in my 40s for a master's in organizational development to look at the systems, because I had insights from doing retained executive search about a person versus a system. And if we look at cultures are really in the most clear definition, processes, actions, and behaviors, period. It's not this amorphous thing. It is, what are the systems of behavior, right? What are the processes that are part of the systems? And what are the actions that people take? And so I actually believe, which is weird, that leadership is at the intersection of individuals and organizations or systems.
Okay. Explain.
You cannot see the multiplier of leadership through one person. You might see a little bit of an uptick, right? But unless you affect a system or an organization with not just the people who are leading the people, but like a leadership mindset in the individual contributors and the high potentials in the frontline workers, right? Then you're not going to see the multiplier that you get from good leadership.
Okay. Have you seen organizations that do that particularly well?
Here's what I'll say. I will say there are periods of time that I have seen organizations do it really, really well. And there's a period of time that they have then fallen from that.
That's a very good and diplomatic answer. Talk to me a little bit about, so does a leadership system outlast a good leader?
Oh, God, that's a good question. This is a really good, like, coffee zingermans. We should have people come in person and hang out with us. And that's like, I think one or the other precludes a period of time, and an individual leader can bring up around, like, to affect the system, which I've seen a lot with chief people officers. And sometimes that system will outlast them even after they leave. But then if you put another individual in, the new CEO who's focused on different things, that system will change. So right now, here, let me give you an example. Right now, I'm doing a CEO succession, publicly traded company, semiconductor. CEO's been there for 20, 30 plus years. So individual affects the system. And as that CEO is exiting and another one is coming in, there are so many things in place from that system that it will hold. But here's on the positive part, because what we see from new CEOs going in, right? We have the largest drop of CEOs that we've seen, that she'll be able to, or he will be able to enact changes in the culture that could actually drive leadership higher, therefore impacting the business more. But I think what you're asking, is the system strong enough to not be knocked?
Or to assimilate leaders and employees to buy into the leadership system?
If the leadership system, like just go to anthropology, does it have like two things from anthropology that I think will define that is, the first one is they're like languaging. So is it a company that has such strong languaging that it's Amazon has such strong languaging that it has a chance to, and the other thing is the power structure, which is not your org chart. Is the who is in power still making, because there are people on an org chart that, like, if you look at organizational network analysis, right, like Rob Cross's work and Michael Arena's work, are there people who are in place that even though they might be not in a certain piece on a org chart that are still like, you have a chance for that to extend as well? Those are like, looking at those two things will impact the answer to your question.
I want to do one final question and then we have to wrap up with the ending questions. I'm curious about, since you see so many leaders and you work with so many leaders, what do you use as predictors to determine whether or not they're going to be successful in that role?
Predictors.
Yeah, like when you're matching somebody, and whether that's your gut or whether that's former experience or culture fit or whatever, like how do you say, yes, I'm fairly certain that this person will be successful there?
Wow, that's such a long question, right? Because you can't, I build scorecards. You know, we also know certain things that come from the company for their scorecard, but we also know things like CEO behavior for success is like predictability. Have they been able to create X amount of success for certain? So I'll use a personal scorecard. I'll use some of the research around CEO success or different measurements of success I have for chief people officers. That's a question I think that people would answer with their gut. And I'm not really comfortable saying that because then I'll be like, I said that and that's not.
That is totally fair. I just wondered if there was like a secret sauce or a silver bullet or something where you're just like, yep, that's the thing. That's the thing that makes somebody successful in this thing. The answer is no.
No.
Fair answer.
I can't say like they're a great leader because there's certain people who are not like good at the human first piece, but are so good at their expertise that they have been able to be successful.
Okay. All right. Final two questions. Cher, thank you for being with us today. I have two final questions for wrap up. The first one is, what's one thing leaders should remember going into this new reality?
Just because we have generative AI to be able to give us rapid response, just because we can do certain things doesn't mean we always should do certain things. I think that's that discernment piece, is that we didn't even talk about the bias in AI. Just because we can doesn't always mean we should. I think the piece is that leaders, because of the piece around clarity, most leaders would benefit from telling themselves, like, you can do anything you want, you just can't do everything you want.
I like that.
That helps us really focus on clarity.
Final question. We ask this to everybody that's on our podcast. We call it the purpose question. Why do you do the work that you do?
So I probably changed that into the meaning question because I don't believe that I have a purpose. Do you know what I mean? Honestly, if I had one purpose, it's not about what I do. Like, my purpose is to like love people. And sometimes that looks like being a mentor, being a friend. Sometimes that looks like being a great colleague. But I do believe in humans and what's possible. And I think that's what drives me. It's not possible about like curiosity, or I do love to learn. Like, I love to learn. But I do think that I have this like belief that if people feel valued and seen and heard, and they feel like they have something to add, we bring out what's, we feed the positive about them, that there are so many things more possible than we really have access to right now, or I think about. But yes, so I would say that's what meaning.
I think that's one of the most beautiful answers we've ever had. And knowing you as I do, your belief in humans it comes through. So thank you for being with us today. And thanks for talking about leadership with us.
Thank you so much. And I hope to see you soon in Ann Arbor.
For sure.
Take care, everybody.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.